All right, I think we're good to go.
All right. I'm good to get started then?
Yes, please do.
All right. So like Rebecca mentioned, she will be putting the PowerPoint slides and some handouts that I have onto the website later today. So don't feel like you have to take extensive notes on everything on the slide as we go through it. You'll have access to that later on. I'll be stopping periodically throughout our presentation today for questions. So if you have something that pops into your mind that you want to ask about, just make a note of that, and there'll be a few opportunities as we transition between different topics to be able to address questions, so we're not waiting until the very end. And I'll give the disclaimer that I am not an expert on this topic in any way. I don't do research on this. I don't work exclusively with this population in treating generational trauma. Today's presentation is largely just a review and interpretation of the literature on this topic. So my goals for today for us are to have a better understanding of what generational trauma is and how this differs from other types of trauma, as well as looking at some of the mechanisms and how this type of trauma gets transmitted from generation to generation. We'll briefly touch on some of the treatment options for this. I don't want to spend too much time on it just because I know not everybody here is a therapy provider. And the therapy options that we're going to be talking about, you need additional training with. So I just want to briefly summarize those. And if you're interested in them, you can look them up more on your own time. But more importantly, as we go through today, I want to be touching on some ways that we can support and work more effectively with individuals and families who are experiencing generational trauma. And my third goal, and this isn't really something that we'll get to as part of the presentation today, but something I'd like you to do on your own, is just to reflect on your own experiences. So we know that part of doing this work is being aware of what we're bringing to the table. So by reflecting on what's happened in your family history and your own experiences, hopefully that will help you be able to work more effectively with the populations that you're serving. So before we get into generational trauma, I want to briefly bring us back to basics and talk about trauma. A lot of us deal with this on a pretty regular basis, so this really isn't anything new. But when we work with it so much, it's easy to become desensitized to it. And especially since it's become mainstream, it's easy for this word to get misused. And we really want to make sure, especially as professionals in our fields, that we're using this word mindfully and deliberately to describe events that are actually traumas and not just things that are difficult or stressful for us. Because when we misuse the word, it really takes away the meaning of it. And when we start calling everything trauma, then nothing is trauma. So by definition, trauma is exposure to actual or threatened death, injury, or violence. This can be something that's experienced firsthand. It can be witnessed happening to somebody else. It can be something that is learned about happening to someone else, or we can have repeated exposure to details of trauma. It's important to remember that our trauma response is not the same thing as the trauma event. It's our reaction and our perception of the trauma that makes it traumatizing, not the event itself. So a lot of people experience trauma throughout their life. A lot of people aren't traumatized by it. So it's important that we recognize the significance to the perception, especially with the clients that we're working with. A lot of them don't have just one trauma. And we really want to be mindful that we're not putting significance to their experiences that they're not putting on it themselves. Also be aware that just because someone has a trauma response does not mean they have PTSD. PTSD is a clinical diagnosis. The individual has to meet criteria for multiple symptoms and multiple domains. Symptoms need to be pervasive over a period of time, and they need to cause significant impairment in that individual. So just because someone has one or two responses to a trauma does not mean they have PTSD. So again, just one of those words that we need to be mindful that we're using appropriately with the population that we're serving. Some just statistics about trauma. This probably isn't anything too mind-boggling to anybody. Anywhere from about 70 to 90% of people will experience at least one trauma in their life. Of those people, about 20% do go on to develop PTSD or some sort of clinical trauma response. Treatment's effective. We know that whether that's therapy or medication, any sort of treatment is helpful in reducing symptoms and their severity of symptoms. And about a third of people, even with proper treatment and medication, never see a complete elimination of their symptoms. They might see improvement to varying degrees, but they might not see a complete elimination of those symptoms. And we also know that a lot of people who have PTSD also meet criteria for other diagnoses, such as substance abuse and mood disorders. So PTSD often isn't seen as a lone diagnosis. So now that we've gone through some of the basics, I want to look at now generational trauma. So generational trauma, by definition, is when an individual has a trauma response to a trauma experienced by a family member in a previous generation. So this would be me having a trauma response to a trauma that my parents had, or my grandparents had, or my great-grandparents had. A handful of different terminology that we use to describe this: transgenerational trauma, intergenerational trauma, multi-generational trauma. These all by and large refer to the same phenomenon, that I'm having a trauma response to something that somebody else in my family experienced. Couple things that I want to differentiate between that we often use generational trauma to describe that isn't quite what we're going to be talking about today. The first is this idea of intergenerational transmission of violence and abuse. This idea that I abuse my kids because my parents abused me, their parents abused them before that, and their parents before that. And we're just repeating this behavior. So again, generational trauma is the trauma response that we're looking at, not necessarily repeating the same behaviors. Another term that often gets lumped in with generational trauma that's not quite synonymous is historical trauma. So this is when a group of people have a shared traumatic experience. Oftentimes this is a racial or cultural group, not always, but some examples of historical traumas in our own history would be events like the Holocaust, Rwandan genocide, slavery of African Americans, 9/11, institutionalization of Native Americans. And the reason it's important to make this distinction is because when a collective group of people have a shared traumatic experience, it really changes the infrastructure of the culture that we don't see when trauma is experienced on an individual basis or within a family system. So for example, the Jews in the Holocaust, having that experience really changed what it meant to identify as a Jew, how they related to other people who are a part of that culture, as well as how they related to people who are not a part of that culture. So a little bit of background on how we know what we know about generational trauma. A lot of this does come from studying historically traumatic events. And from a research perspective, this makes a lot of sense. We have a very defined trauma at a very defined point in time, and we have a large sample size to study. So this isn't necessarily new. This was first alluded to back by Anna Freud in one of her books in 1940s. And honestly, it was probably talked about in the field of psychology before that. She was looking specifically at mothers who experienced the London Blitz and the response that they had, as well as the impact that their response had on their children, and found that women who had more of a trauma response and PTSD-like symptoms had children who also had that same response, as opposed to mothers who showed more resiliency and had children who also showed resiliency. In terms of research, this was first published back in 1966 and looking at the children of Holocaust survivors. And what they found was that children of the Holocaust survivors were having very similar trauma responses that their parents had. Now, the children obviously did not experience the Holocaust, but they were having the same response that the survivor themselves had. This study was received with a lot of negative criticism. It was very controversial at the time. People were not very supportive of it, but it really acted as a springboard for this field of generational trauma in terms of expanding what we know. Follow-up study was done several decades later, again looking at now the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors and finding that now the grandchildren are having very similar responses that the survivors themselves had. Now, keep in mind as we go through today that the research on this has been very contradictory. There's a lot of information out there that supports this idea that individuals can have a trauma response to a trauma in a previous generation, but there's also a lot of research that doesn't support this. So obviously as we go through today, I'm going to be looking at the research that does, but just keep in mind that this is only part of the story. We also have some limitations in being able to generalize what we know about generational trauma. So part of the issue is that with humans, well, it takes several decades for us to get to the next generation. So a lot of what we're looking at comes from animal models. And we can't always generalize what we're finding in animal models to humans. So there are some limitations in that. So, and a lot of this, because it's so contradictory, because we're having a hard time generalizing things from animals to humans, a lot of this is still theoretical. So there's a lot of information that we still need to learn about this. So in terms of what this looks like and the clients that we're serving and how to tell when we're looking at generational trauma and when we're not, well, I'd like to tell you that there's like a magic symptom or a magic characteristic that you're going to see it and it's just going to stand out in flashing lights. This is generational trauma. Unfortunately, that's not the case. We're looking at a trauma response. So that means we're already looking at it. It's everything that we're already dealing with. It looks like mood disorders. It looks like behavior problems and conduct problems, domestic violence, relationship issues, substance use. It looks like everything we're already seeing. Now, this doesn't mean that we can't determine what's generational trauma and what's not. And we're already taking steps towards this by looking at this through a trauma-informed lens. So to be able to look at this through a generational lens, we just need to do more of what we're already doing. So by taking a trauma-informed approach, we're changing the question of what's wrong with you, looking at the behavior, and we're taking a step back and we're asking what happened to you. We're looking at that behavior in the context of that person's experiences. Well, to look at it through a generational lens, we just need to take one more step back. And instead of stopping at what happened to you, we're going to ask what happened in the family. What happened to mom and dad? What happened to grandparents? And we're going to try to look at that behavior, not just within the context of that individual's experiences, but of the family's experiences and influences. Before we dive into some of the ways in which trauma gets transmitted, are there any questions about some of the basics of generational trauma?
So I just unmuted everybody, or I tried to. It looks like some are unmuting. If you muted yourself, you can unmute yourself if anybody has a question.
I'm gonna go with no.
I guess
So
not. Go
moving
right
on.
ahead, Cassie.
All right. So we're going to look at how trauma gets transmitted, both through a nature lens and a nurture lens. At the, whoops. Am I unmuted? Okay.
Yes, sorry.
Okay, no, you're fine. So we'll start by looking at this from the nature lens, looking at how trauma changes our biology. So the first way I want to look at is this concept called epigenetics. And basically what this means is that our environment can change how our gene is expressed. So what's happening is our gene is changing without our DNA changing. So the way this works is you have your entire genetic code, the DNA you're born with is the DNA that you're going to die with, that doesn't change. However, within your genetic sequence, you have the traits and the genetic markers for all different types of characteristics. Now, some of those traits are going to be turned on, they're going to be expressed, and some of these traits are going to be turned off. They're not going to be expressed. So epigenetics is how our environment can change things that are on and turn them to off, and turn off things that are on. Now, I don't want to give the impression that this is an easy process by any means and that these change on a daily basis. When a gene's expression changes, it's typically fairly permanent for the person's life. Not to say that it can't change again, but usually these changes are fairly permanent and pervasive. So this is not the same thing as our body's chemical response when we're dealing with trauma and stress. So we know that when we deal with trauma or stress on a daily basis, our body floods with cortisol, prepare us for action. Within our brain, our prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that's responsible for decision making, being logical and analytical, that largely shuts down, and we're stuck with our limbic system or our lizard brain that's taking over. So this is the fight, flight, freeze response. And once the stress or the trauma has passed, our prefrontal cortex will eventually go back online. The cortisol that's flooded our body goes back to baseline, and we're able to go on with everything going on in our life. So the chemical response and the brain response to stress that comes on a daily basis and situational basis is not the same thing as the pervasive changes that come with changes to our genes. Now, Within our genes, only about 2% of our DNA actually accounts for our physical traits. So things like our hair color and our eye color. These, for the most part, are pretty constant. We don't wake up every other morning with our eyes changing different colors. So our physical traits are pretty much as they are. The other 98% of our DNA is what we refer to as non-coding DNA. So this is responsible for everything else. So things like our personality traits, how we respond behaviorally to stimuli, how we respond emotionally to stimuli. And these are the traits that are a little bit more easily influenced by our environment and can be changed based on environmental factors. So one of the mechanisms by which this changes, there's a handful of them, I'll go over the one that's easiest to understand, is the process called DNA methylation. So you might need to move your video because I realize my face is covering up our little picture over here. So if you look at the gene on the left, this is a gene that's turned on. When we go through a process called DNA methylation, methyl groups get added to the gene and that switches them to off, or it dampens their expression. Now, the opposite of this would then be DNA demethylation, which is where methyl groups get taken off. So a trait that's turned off can then get turned on. And I won't bore you with all the science behind chemical bonding on that. Now, it's easy to think in terms of trauma that these changes are bad. And I really want to caution you on that because these changes or these epigenetic changes can very much be a really good thing. It helps us change the ways that we respond to our environment, basically adds more tools to our toolbox. And even not in the context of trauma, this is very helpful. The world that we're living in is becoming more and more complex than it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So there's more ways that we need to be in order to adapt to our environment. So having these changes as part of our genetic code is really helpful so that we can respond to situations more effectively. And in terms of trauma, this is very helpful because it prepares us to experience and deal with the traumas that our parents experienced. So for example, if I'm living in a community where there's a lot of gang violence and drive-by shootings, having a certain trauma response is going to help me stay alive. And if that gets baked into my DNA and I transmit that to my children, they're now more prepared to be able to adapt to that environment and respond to that environment effectively. One of the ways that we saw this was somewhat recently, about 5 or 6 years ago, they did a study in mice. So again, like I said at the beginning, take this with a grain of salt because we can't always generalize animal models to humans. But they took mice and they exposed them to the smell of cherry blossoms. And the reason they chose cherry blossoms is because mice have a known genetic code that responds to this scent. So they're able to measure the response. In addition to the cherry blossom smell, they also shocked the mice. So the mice are now conditioned with a fear response. So naturally they saw a fear response when they pumped the cages full of cherry blossom smells that mice responded in fear. What they did then is they took the offspring of these mice, so these would be what we call the first generation survivors, and they also exposed them to the smell of cherry blossoms. Now, they did not shock these mice, so these mice have never known the trauma of being shocked with the smell of the cherry blossoms like their parents did. And what they found is that these mice also responded in fear. Their gene for the cherry blossoms was much more sensitive. They took this one step further and did it now with the grandchildren of the survivors. And they also pumped their cages with the smell of cherry blossoms. They didn't shock them. And what they found is that they still had a fear response in mice 2 generations later. Now, there's some variation in how we use the different terms of generational trauma, and that by and large refers to how many generations later we're seeing a trauma response. So intergenerational trauma means that we're seeing the trauma response 1 generation after the survivor. Multi-generational trauma, we're seeing it 2 generations after the survivor. Transgenerational trauma, 3 or more generations after the survivor. So by and large, we can use these terms interchangeably, but in a research setting, this is largely what they're referring to is just how many generations later we're seeing a trauma response. Trauma also has the ability to be passed on during pregnancy. We know that the uterine environment and what's going into the mother's body can affect fetal development. We've studied this a lot in terms of substance use. We know that the effects of caffeine, alcohol, nicotine, illicit drugs, that all has an impact on fetal development. So when a mother has a stress response and those chemicals are flooding her body, that also can impact fetal development. This was studied shortly after 9/11. They looked at women who were pregnant and were close to ground zero at the time of the World Trade Center attacks. And they followed them throughout the rest of their pregnancy and in the first few years of life of their children. And what they found was that women who had a higher stress response or more of a trauma response gave birth to children who went on to develop what we would probably characterized as ADHD characteristics, as opposed to women who did not have that same stress or trauma response, did not have that same type of characteristics in their children. Another thing to consider is that when a woman experiences stress or trauma during a pregnancy, it's not just her or her child that's being affected, it's also the potential of her grandchildren. Because when a woman is pregnant, within the child, there's what we call the germ cells. So in a female, this would be the egg cells. In a male, this is the precursor sperm cells. So when a woman experiences trauma or stress, she's being impacted, her child is being impacted, and then the cells that are going to develop into her grandchildren are also being impacted. So I don't want you to give you the idea that this is all doom and gloom. We do have the capacity within our genetic response that not everything gets passed on. Things that within our genes tend to get filtered out if they're not aiding in our survival. So just because a trait is being passed on or experienced in one generation does not mean that it's for sure going to be passed on or seen, generations later. Another way that trauma can get passed on in pregnancy is this concept called fetal maternal microchimerism. And I'll be very upfront, this sounds very sci-fi when I try to explain it. But basically what this is saying is that cellular information from the child is being passed to the mother. We often think that trauma is being unidirectional from parent to child, but fetal maternal microchimerism is the process in which information is being shared in the opposite direction. So this was studied more in terms of genetic disorders and diseases, not so much trauma, but definitely something that we might be looking at in the future more so. And the reason that this is significant is because the developing child isn't just DNA from mom, it's DNA from dad. It's half DNA from mom, half DNA from dad. So if the child is sharing information with mom, that means that some of the information that the child got from dad is getting shared with the mother. So like I said, a little sci-fi. We're still doing a lot of studying into this. It's been studied more in terms of diseases rather than trauma, but definitely something that we'll be looking more towards in the future. Take a quick break for questions again before we get into parenting and how environmental influences can transfer trauma. Are there any questions on biology and genetics?
I actually do have a question. So like if you look at mother passing it to baby, then baby growing up passing it to a grandchild, or like even with the mice, is it noted if they have like a lesser fear reaction with each generation, or is that measured anywhere? Or
not that I could really find. I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, I think that goes back to this idea that when a response isn't serving us, it tends to get weeded out generation after generation. And every trauma response is going to be different. So just because my response is, one way does not mean that my child is necessarily going to have the same or similar. So I know that really doesn't answer your question, but I think that still is an area that we really need to look into in terms of how far along are we seeing these trauma responses and to what severity are we seeing these trauma responses.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions that people have? All right. So I'll give the caveat before we get into this slide that as I'm referring to parenting behaviors, I don't necessarily mean from the parent itself. So don't take that too literally. Parenting can be from the natural parent, it can be from a grandparent, it can be from an aunt or uncle. It's basically any adult or caregiver who's having influence in their life. So I'll be referring to that as a parent just for simplicity's sake during this slide, but don't hold to that too literally. So what we're going to be focusing on here is that our trauma response can be passed on through a parent's behavior. And there's a couple ways in which we're going to see this. So the first is our communication style about the trauma. And there's two ways that tend to be rather negative, or I guess that tend to pass on the trauma response. And those are kind of extremes of the same spectrum. So this idea of conspiracy of silence, we're not talking about at all. It's this huge family secret that nobody talks about, versus oversharing. We're sharing all the gory details about what happened. And there's risks and benefits to doing this with silence. You know, there's definitely the benefit of this was a painful experience. We don't want to share this. We're not going to talk about it. But the issue there is that the children know that something's up. And they tend to then have a very inaccurate idea of what that trauma actually was, and it makes it very distressing for them. The opposite side, oversharing, obviously if you're sharing details about a trauma in a very developmentally inappropriate way, that causes issues as well. So what we're finding is that when our communication about trauma that can mitigate that transmission of trauma is to, one, share about trauma in a developmentally appropriate manner. Don't be sharing about details that aren't necessarily appropriate for that child to know at that age. And the second way is to make sure that when you're sharing about the trauma and the survivor, having positive stories about the survivor before the traumatic experience really helps mitigate the transmission of the trauma response. So if the traumatic event was grandpa in Vietnam, hearing stories about grandpa pre-war that were very positive help change the view that grandpa isn't just this trauma and that there were positive aspects to him, and they see him as a different, not just the traumatic experience, but more of a whole person, and that can help mitigate the trauma response being transmitted. Second way that trauma can get passed on is the parenting style. This probably isn't anything new. We know that certain parenting styles are more effective than other parenting styles, and certain parenting styles can cause problems within the children. So parents who tend to be very preoccupied or have unresolved trauma tend to be very disorganized and inconsistent in their parenting. And we know that children do very well with structure, routine, consistency. So having parents that aren't able to provide that can be one way in which the trauma response is being transmitted. Another way is when the child feels a responsibility to the parent for the suffering. So this does not mean that the child feels responsible for the suffering. They feel responsible for carrying the burden of that. So these children tend to be parentified. They tend to carry their parents' emotional burdens. And in carrying their parents' emotional burdens, they aren't able to address their own emotional needs. So they go through their life with their own emotional needs not being met. So by the time they reach adulthood and they are addressing this, they don't have the capacity to do that. So now they're relying on their children to help carry that burden. And then those children are putting their emotional needs to the side. And now we have a perpetuating cycle. The other way is through identification, I guess over-identification with the parent's suffering. So these are individuals that really see significant parts of themselves in their parents, and they see that trauma is not just something that happened to mom and dad, but something that happened to me too. So these children tend to have a very general fear. They're very distrusting of people, particularly people that they see have similarities to the individual that perpetuated the trauma. And they tend to kind of live in this state of mind, almost expecting something bad to happen to them. Now, some of the message that the caregivers give about trauma can also be very traumatizing and perpetuate the beliefs and the narrative that we have about the traumatic experience. So this kind of goes back to what I was talking about a little bit earlier about the communication styles and not being effective. So these are some other ways in which what we're sharing about trauma can kind of enhance or pass on the trauma response. So one of those is the belief that because the parent suffered, the child suffered. This idea that, well, I didn't have all these things, therefore you can't have these opportunities. Or because I had this experience, therefore you're not allowed to have any positive experiences. So the parent suffering or the caregiver suffering is really the basis of how they go about interacting with their child and allowing their child to experience the world. Another message that sometimes gets passed on is that the parent's suffering is the end all be all of everything. Nothing can possibly compare because the parent had it so bad. This is the worst thing ever. And whatever distress or challenge or trauma the child faced, nothing could possibly be as bad. Almost this idea that, you know, their trauma or their experiences don't matter. Like your best friend died in a car accident. Well, that's too bad. I watched all my friends die in the war. You're fine. It's not as bad as what I had, and that kind of belief. So this idea that the trauma is always front and center in the comparison that they give to the children. And sometimes a parent's way of coping with their own trauma is very unhealthy and in and of itself can be traumatizing. So if the parent's way of dealing with their trauma is to turn to substance use, have the child seen their parent, you know, passed out with a needle in their arm or unconscious and not being able to wake up, or other dangers associated with substance use, those experiences can also be traumatizing and not just pass on their trauma response, but also create their own trauma about the event. In addition to parenting, there's also some societal messages that can pass on our trauma response. And one of these is this idea of disenfranchised grief. Basically what this is saying is your grief doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to, you know, there's no reason that you need to be addressing this, that there's something wrong with you for wanting to, you know, process your grief or to mourn something. And these are things that we see a lot of the times. You know, we hear these messages, you know, that are given to us or that, you know, we hear given to other people. Things like, well, they died 6 months ago. It's time to move on. You need to stop grieving now. Or this idea that people don't see color anymore. You need to stop worrying about that. Or you weren't there. Why are you so bothered by this? Those are all messages that we might mean well in saying that and think we're encouraging someone to move on with their life, but really we're very much invalidating their grief and their experience. So an example that came up related to this was in the aftermath of the Oklahoma City bombing. And the medical staff that were treating the victims were really needing to talk to somebody about the experience themselves. And the message that they were getting from the superiors in their workplace was, well, you weren't there. This shouldn't bother you, or this is just part of your job. You need to deal with it. So this idea that their experience and the grief that they had about an experience didn't matter. So this is another way that society kind of transmits a trauma response because we're not allowing people to address what they're needing to address. And I know we're talking about trauma, and I only have one slide on this, so I'm definitely not doing its due diligence. But resiliency gets passed on the same way as trauma does. So, and we know this because, you know, like I mentioned at the statistics at the beginning, 20% of people develop PTSD. The other percent don't go on. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not impacted by the experience, that it doesn't have meaning to them, but the trauma doesn't always cause disruption in our lives. So there's a lot of resiliency that helps people address trauma in an effective and meaningful way. And one of these ways is what we call post-traumatic growth. And this is the idea that we can create positive change as the result of struggle and trauma and crises. And some of the theories behind why this is that individuals can reconstruct the narrative that they have about the trauma to one of victor instead of victim, or triumph over tragedy, or they're able to find meaning in the event, or be able to find personal growth, that even though this bad thing happened to me, I was able to gain this trait or characteristic or knowledge about myself from it. And this was really illustrated very well in Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. You know, he recounts his story as a survivor of the Holocaust, and it wasn't necessarily a debilitating and traumatizing experience for him. Yes, it sucked. Yes, it was difficult. Yes, it was awful, but he was able to go on and live a very meaningful life and found meaning in that experience. I'll stop briefly again for questions before we go into some of the treatment and supporting ways we can support clients. Any questions people have?
Cassie, this is Corey, more of a comment than a question, but I think your comments about disenfranchised grief and how that was shown in the Oklahoma City bombing, I think gives us some really important messages about how to handle healthcare's traumatic responses to the current pandemic.
Absolutely.
And I also love the transmission of resiliency comment, and that sounds like it could be a lunch and learn all in itself at some point. So thanks for including that really important point.
For sure. Other questions? All right, so I want to briefly go over some of the therapy treatment models. Like I said, I'm just going to kind of keep this brief. If there's something that you're interested in, definitely go ahead and do some more research into this on your own time to get a better understanding of it. So these are therapy treatments, excuse me, that either have been found beneficial specifically or have been used already in treating generational trauma, or the developers of these models have identified that generational trauma, or that they can be used for generational trauma as well. So I'm going to briefly go through several of these. So the first, the intergenerational trauma treatment model. From what I found, this is really the only model that focuses on treating 2 generations of trauma at the same time. It's broken into 3 phases. The first is, and this is a very watered down version of what this means, but the first phase is a group setting where they're getting information about trauma and coping. The second phase is focused on treating the caregiver's trauma and being more attuned to their own needs. And then the third phase is treating the child's trauma and helping the parent then be in tune with the child's needs and enhance their relationship. Second model is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. This is a treatment specifically for children, not for adults, but it does incorporate a lot of caregiver involvement. This also has 3 phases. The first is a very skill-based phase in helping individuals learn about trauma and develop coping skills to be able to process it effectively. The second phase is where they create a narrative about the trauma, and the therapist goes through with them to help correct some of the distorted thought patterns they have about the trauma that's impeding their ability to be able to move forward from the experience. And then the third phase is where they share the trauma narrative with a trusted adult, and then they expand on the skills that were discussed in the first phase to be able to enhance resiliency moving forward. The attachment or self-regulation and developmental competencies framework also is more of a child-based or child and adolescent-based approach, and it also incorporates caregiver involvement. So this also has 3 phases. The first phase is more of the incorporation of the caregiver. So this is helping the caregiver manage their own emotional response, being attuned to the needs of their children, being able to respond consistently, and to be able to develop a safe and structured environment for the child to continue to heal in. The second phase is more geared towards the child and helping them identify their feelings, what's causing those feelings, how to regulate their emotions, and being able to express them safely and effectively. And then the third phase is that building resiliency. So helping them master tasks, helping them be able to apply different skills to be able to cope effectively with their environment, things like that. EMDR is another therapeutic intervention that is beneficial in treating both trauma and generational trauma. This is unique because it really doesn't focus on the trauma story, and the therapist doesn't need to know the details of the trauma in order to be able to help the client. So this really focuses on the bilateral brain stimulation. So that's how our brain processes our day while we sleep, but when we experience trauma and we're not able to process it fully, that's where EMDR can be beneficial, because the therapist can help initiate that, that brain processing. One of the reasons this is effective in generational trauma is that trauma isn't necessarily always, you know, the thoughts or the beliefs that we have. Sometimes we experience it in a more visceral way and sensations in our body, and that's where EMDR can be very effective. And in treating generational trauma with this method, it doesn't necessarily need to be the youngest generation in line. So it doesn't have to be the kid, it can be the caregiver. And the idea with that is that when we're able to treat trauma in the caregiver, it helps them be able to regulate better and parent more effectively, so that parent-wise, they're not passing on trauma responses to their children. Narrative approach. This is really important because the stories we tell about our experience and who we are matter a lot. I mean, there's a reason there are so many memoirs out there about people's experiences. It's cathartic to talk about our stories. It's validating to have them shared, or to hear validation when they're shared. And going through a narrative approach can help an individual be able to express their story and be able to challenge those parts of the story that aren't helping them heal. So these are a couple of the resources that I found that help give some really good writing prompts, or some prompts of questions to help really get into some of the beliefs and stories that we have about trauma. Now, these are not the only books out there. I mean, you can Google it and you could probably find hundreds of them, but these are just the ones that I was familiar with and found to be very enlightening. And obviously, when we're talking about trauma within the family system, looking at it from a family systems perspective is very important. One of the key aspects of a family systems approach is creating a genogram, which is basically a family tree. And this is something that you don't necessarily need to be a therapist in order to do with your clients. So this is something that anybody could do. And the benefits of this is that we're able to look for patterns and see some of those trends within the family system. So in the book, It Didn't Start With You by Mark Wolin, he has an interesting approach to treating generational trauma. So I won't get into his entire approach, but I think there's a lot of benefit in looking at the genogram. And one of the things that he found through his own experience is that when people use language that doesn't quite match up with their experience, or it just seems off in some way, that's his clue that there's generational trauma issues going on. So one of the examples that he gave in his book was a woman who was experiencing really debilitating fear about keeping her children safe. And in assessing the situation, there really wasn't anything out of the norm. Like, the kids had a safe environment, they weren't, predisposed to any risks, very normal upbringing. So this intense fear just seemed really out of proportion for the circumstances she was describing. So what they did as part of the process was they created a genogram, and they looked at some of the experiences in the family history and really looked at who in the family might have had a similar experience, or this belief, or this experience of not being able to keep their children safe. And what they found was that several generations back, she had some family, either grandparents or great-grandparents, who immigrated to the US. And during that journey, the children died. So there would have been a belief likely with those parents that I can't keep my children safe. So, and that was something that got passed down then to her. Now, his interventions are very unique. So if you're interested in that, I'd recommend reading the book. I won't go into that. But just from my own personal clinical experience, I found a lot of benefit with genograms, especially when I was working in residential treatment. This is something that we did with all of our clients. We would create a genogram and we would go through and look at, okay, who in the family had mental illness, who in the family had substance use issues, who in the family had abuse or trauma. And for the clients, that really seemed validating to be able to see on paper those experiences. It wasn't necessarily new information to them. This is stuff that had been, given to them throughout their lives. They'd experienced it firsthand. But there was something very validating about seeing it on paper and seeing those patterns and really reinforcing the idea that this isn't my fault. So to summarize, how we can help our clients heal. And these are practical strategies that we can all do. And I've already hit on a lot of them throughout our, about 50 minutes together. So the first is to change your lens. So this was one of the first things I mentioned. This is what we're doing with a trauma-informed approach. Instead of asking what's wrong with you, asking what happened to you, and to take a generational lens to this, asking what happened in the family, what happened to mom and dad, what happened to grandparents, and looking at those experiences as well. Giving your clients information about trauma and transmission of trauma. Knowledge is power. So you're not going to hurt them in any way by helping them understand what's happening to them. If anything, it's going to be very validating. And like I mentioned, this idea that it's not just me, it's not just my fault. Look at the family history, put it out on paper, create the genogram. That's a very visual tool, not just for you, but for them to help understand those patterns of transmission and to understand where things are coming from. One of the things, and you can kind of take this or leave this, but look at the unique language that's being used. What seems off? What doesn't quite fit with what they're saying that might be more indicative of somebody else's in the family's experiences, to see if maybe they're inheriting some of the narrative or some of the beliefs that have been passed down in other family members. Hear their story. Like I said, hearing people want to share their experiences. There's value in sharing about our experiences. It's validating to have them received well. So take the time to just sit with them and hear those family stories, hear about what's going on in their life, hear about what happened in the family history, and just sit with them and share those memories and share those narratives. And of course, do your own self-reflection. Part of being able to do this work effectively is knowing what you're bringing to the table. So being able to see the patterns within your own family history can help you work effectively with your clients and help them understand what's going on in their family history as well. Here's a list of books that I have found helpful in just generational trauma. But honestly, you can just Google generational trauma books and you'll find hundreds, if not thousands, of reading material on this topic. A lot of them are memoirs about people's experiences and how they're dealing with the trauma of their ancestors. But there's a couple books, and I'll point them out here at the bottom. Adult Children of Alcoholics is really looking at how having substance use in the family can really impact the children and grandchildren generations on. Emotionally Immature Parents looks at how parents who aren't emotionally available or who are very emotionally reactive can help perpetuate some of those trauma responses and how that impacts children and grandchildren. And then this last book really looks at how slavery and trauma within the African American community gets perpetuated. And these will be on the website that will be, or in the links that will be sent out later. So if you don't have a chance to write all these down, you'll have access to them when Rebecca sends them out. And I will just leave you then with this quote by William Faulkner that the past is never dead. It's not even the past. Our life story didn't start with our first memory or when we were born or when we conceived. We're a ball of the experiences of our family in the past, and it's all kind of played a role in bringing us to where we are today. So it's not just in the past, it's here with us now, for better or for worse. Any questions, comments, reflections that people have before I wrap up for the day then?
Cassie, I just want to say thank you. It was definitely informative for sure. And it kind of gave me a different learning perspective on, working with people as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
The others are saying the same thing in the chat box.
Oh, perfect. Glad it was helpful.
Some information we've already had and some new information, and it caused me to think differently about both some personal and professional interactions that I have. So thanks for that.
Wonderful. And one of the handouts that I'll be sending to Rebecca to share with you is a list of questions to help with your own personal reflection, as well as a list of questions to ask with clients to help gain some more understanding of traumas in their background as well. So you'll have access to some more information when that gets sent out a little bit later today.
Great. Any other questions for Cassie before we wrap up? Just lots of thank yous in the chat. Lots of people recognizing that this is important information. Okay, well, we are planning another lunch and learn for next month. It'll probably be virtual as well, so watch for the information on that. And thank you all for taking time to join us today. Thanks a lot, Cassie. It was great.
Thank you.